Welcome back, John Alcoholic.
Hey, John.
In my early recovery, I completely glazed over the second step. I just thought there wasn't much of a step to work here. My sponsor asked me, very first sponsor said, "Do you believe in God?" And I said, "Yep." And he said, "Okay, let's go on to the third step." And consequently, for a long time, I didn't give we agnostics much thought, credence, because I'm not agnostic, right? Why read it? Like to the wives, it's not really pertinent to me. I'm not an agnostic. I'm embarrassed to tell you that, but it's just the truth. I got one story. If I'm in a meeting and we're reading we agnostics, I'll read it and I'll tell you something profound or something, but I really didn't grasp that is me. Later went on to read, that when we get here, we're all agnostics, without exception. The definition of a Gnostic is somebody with knowledge, and they're not talking book knowledge, they're talking experiential knowledge, that type of knowledge. And so an agnostic is somebody without that experience, without that knowledge of, without that living experience. And so by definition, I'm agnostic because if I had a working relationship with the power greater than myself, at some point I would have accessed that power, reverse course, and gone the other direction, right? Before it got as bad as it got, I would have done that. So I'm an agnostic when I get here. And then for a little while after that, I've thought that meant I need to figure God out. Let me figure out the right belief system. And this is, of course, in hindsight. And what I really learned after a number of painful years, I had a second surrender. Well, it's probably a third or a fourth, but I had a surrender at about 17 or 18 years of sobriety, and every aspect of my life was a complete train wreck. Everyone. My finance life, my business life, my marriage life, my physical life, everything was completely trashed. As the book says, crushed by a self-imposed crisis. I'll briefly tell you that my house was in foreclosure, my cars were getting repossessed, my lights were getting turned off. I almost ruined my marriage, violating my wedding vows. My business had gone bankrupt. I got arrested in sobriety. The IRS was garnishing my checking account what seemed like every other month. They got these funny laws about when you withhold payroll taxes, you got to send them to the IRS. It's kind of unreasonable. There should be a little grace period, for that. But everything was just a mess. And I had a new surrender. I had a surrender at a depth and a weight that I'd never had before. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in 3. But that got me back into the steps. And through one of God's little bank shots, I got introduced to a guy that loves this book. And I really thought, kind of like an inventory was my problem. Like, I must not have, done the 4th step the right way. And I said, look, let's go back through all the steps. Let's see what we missed here, And I'm so grateful that we did that, because a lot of times, guys come to me, multiple years of sobriety and say, I need to review 8, or I need to review 4. And I said, let's go back and let's do all of it, Let's go back at this with an open mind, like Scott talked about in the first session, right? With this idea that just some of my old ideas are just completely wrong. Some things that some things right now that are absolutely true are dead wrong. And when I took this position that I took it to the next level, I just don't know anything about recovery. Look at my life, and going through the second step in a different way transformed me in a way that was just indescribable. Because many times I thought I have a third step dilemma, like I can't, I don't know how to turn this over. Most of the time when I'm talking to a guy who thinks he's having a problem letting something go or turning something over, it's really a second step issue. It's a concept issue. Bill says a number of times in We Agnostics that talking about conception, right? on 46, the last paragraph, much to our relief, we discovered we did not need to consider another's conception of God. Our own conception, however inadequate, was sufficient. On the top of 47, it says, when therefore we speak to you of God, we mean your own conception. And he mentions it again in working with others. He says that, in working with the new man, make it emphatic, and he says this in italics, that he does not have to agree with our conception of God. He can choose any conception he likes, provided that it makes sense. So, when I start having this conversation with a new guy or an old guy, I don't buy this idea of, well, the doorknob or the light bulb is, my higher power, because it doesn't make sense. Because the book says it has to make sense. So there's a little caveat. But more importantly, in Bill's story, we all know that famous encounter, right? I mean, I really think our lives are at stake, and Ebby's trying to 12-step Bill. Bill's like, what's gotten into my old buddy? His old running buddy shows up, clean and sober. And Ebby says, man, I've got religion. And what Bill says, I just love it. I was aghast. I mean, I don't know a better way to just say completely, utterly disgusted. Because Bill had all these old ideas about God. And it's probably worth going to that page. Middle of 12. Ebby hits him right between the eyes. Probably it's one of those moments that Scott described. Ebby had no idea he was probably going to say this. My friend suggested what seemed like a novel idea. Why don't you choose your own conception of God? And this next paragraph, that statement hit me hard. It melted the icy intellectual mountain in whose shadow I had lived and shivered many years. I stood in the sunlight at last. If Ebby says, no, listen, Bill, you've got to believe in little baby Jesus or you're not going to make it. We're probably not sitting here, right? At least maybe for another period of time. And that's what's awesome about Alcoholics Anonymous, We don't demand that you believe anything. But if you're going to stay sober, you have to find something to believe in. Because if I believe I can fix me, I'm not going to make any progress, right? All the great religions have one thing in common. Whether you're Christian, Buddhist, Muslim, Mother Earth, whatever your higher power is, they all have one thing in common. They all send the drunks to Alcoholics Anonymous, right? So we don't care what you believe. That's belief system stuff, and that's not what we talk about in here. At least for me, I had it all wrong. I chased the right belief system to the ends of the earth in here, trying to figure it out. If I can just figure God out and get checks in the right boxes, I'll get in God's good favor, because that's what I need. If I can just get the God dial up to 10, then I'll be good. But it's not about, it wasn't for me about figuring out the right belief system. And I'm not, I'm a member of a religion. I love the religion. I'm not dogging that at all. I want to be really clear about that. Religion has its purpose. But this alcoholic, did the Nats just score? I'm a big Nationals fan. The World Series is about to start, so maybe a little Sports Center went off. Let me know what the score is. I need a relationship with this God in my understanding. I believe that these 12 steps are divinely designed. Bill's just a writer here. God's just working through them. Bill's just stealing a little piece from everybody. These 12 steps are divinely designed by God to remove what's blocking me from Him. That's it. Right? I don't have to say the right prayer at the right time of day, at the right cadence, facing the right direction. Bill says when we agnostics, at the end of the day, he's deep down inside, right? But that it's blocked by calamity, right? Drama. That's the modern day term. Pomp, ego, or worship of other things. And so what I have to do is, what's blocking me in the second step, what I found was blocking me in the second step is what I'll talk about, is my old ideas, my misconceptions of God. Bill says 7 times in We Agnostics that we have to get rid of these prejudices. And I was so ignorant when I got here. My sponsor said that to me. I said, what are you talking about, prejudices? says, I'm not prejudiced. You're black. You're my sponsor. I'm not prejudiced. And he's like, that's not what I'm talking about. 7 times in We Agnostics, he says we got to get rid of these prejudices. These old ideas about God. Because these old ideas about God is what's blocking me. I'll share it with someone with you. I know God's keeping score, right? I mean, God's like Santa Claus. You know, do good, you get good. You know, the great bean counter in the sky. You know that image of Lady Justice with the scales? You know, and like I said, if I can just be good enough long enough, I can turn that God love dial up a little bit longer, and I'll get what I want. And if I get what I want, I'll be pretty happy. At least so I think, you know. And one of my other old ideas is that I'm just too broken for God. I'm just too busted. I mean, I don't, you know, God must have had a bad day off when he made me. It was my attitude. You know, and I would propose to you that if your God's not big enough to fix you, you got the wrong God. You know. But this idea of being good enough long enough that God's love or mercy or forgiveness for me was earned was a big problem. You know. It was already there. I just had to accept it. It wasn't about, you know, doing and earning it. It became about receiving and believing. That's all I had to do. You know, go on with the rest of the steps and remove what was blocking me. You know, I had this idea that, like, there was a finite amount of goodness in the world. Like, if Ben came in, you know, the meeting and was raving about, you know, this brand new truck he got, you know, I'd be kind of bitter about it. Or if Ben came in and talked about how something great happened in his life, I'd be kind of, you know, disappointed because there was just this pie size out there, and if you got a piece of pie, that meant there was less pie for me, right? In other words, there's this finite amount of love, but there's not, you know. And so in examining some of these old ideas, it really enabled me to see how these old ideas were just blocking me from God, because that's all these 12 steps are about. It's not, as our friend Bob says, it's not about process of addition, it's one of subtraction. You know, I gotta get rid of this stuff that's, you know, and I remember, like, early on people would say, oh, you just need to kind of fake it till you make it. You just need a mustard seed of faith, you know, to get started. And I guess that's true in some sense. And it's really true when you understand what the definition of mustard seed is. When someone say you need just a little mustard seed to get started, in modern day terms, you think that's just a little grain, you know, half the size of a piece of rice, you know, just a little mustard seed. I've later come to learn the definition of mustard seed. Back in biblical times, there was a guy, his name was Pliny the Elder. He was like the modern day encyclopedia of the time. He was the keeper of all knowledge, you know, in their books, Pliny the Elder. And back then, the definition of mustard seed had 2 characteristics of mustard seed. One, had medicinal healing purposes. Now that's cool, a mustard seed of faith. That makes it a little bit easier. And the second characteristic of mustard seed is that it spreads like wildfire. So if someone tells you just need a mustard seed of faith, you can change your perception of that. You know, I need something that's healing. I need something that spreads like wildfire. And I want to be really clear, you know, in this chapter it clearly says that, look, we can never fully understand or comprehend that which is God. And this is not about figuring it out. And Scott's going to talk a lot about this here in a second, but, you know, what my sponsor asked me to do is just to set aside all these old ideas and come up with some new characteristics of what I need God to be. You know, if I'm really, you know, because I understand, you know, I'm not an idiot. I can sit in my meeting and I can read the steps on the wall, you know, and the third step, I got to turn my will and my life over to the care of God. You know, so if I'm going to do that, what's God got to be? You know, because I'm not going to turn my will and my life over to a God that's keeping score, because I'm in big trouble if God's keeping score, right? Because if I got what I deserved, I wouldn't be sitting here today, and I would suggest that probably you wouldn't either. You know, I need a God that's all-powerful. If God can't fix all my problems, I got the wrong God. I need a God that's all-loving. In other words, this isn't just for the reserved few. I don't believe God's love is just for those who act right and look right, and, you know, it doesn't make sense to me. And Bill says that, right? That the realm of the Spirit is all-inclusive. I think, you know, I love what Scott says about the greatest promise being that 12th step. But I love the promise that God does not make hard terms on those who seek Him. I need that desperately. And in just coming up with some characteristics of what I needed God to be, and going through the rest of the steps and seeing if they were true. what I found was a God that was more for me than I was. And that was hard to do. All of my old ideas about opinions and thoughts about God came from really, other people and TV and movies and stuff, and really had no basis in any kind of experience or fact. Just, grandma saying, this is going to happen if you do something wrong, or the TV's idea about God. And I had to be willing just to set that all aside, and seeing how that came about. In developing, if this is about developing a relationship, it's very similar to developing that relationship with an intimate relationship. When I started dating my wife, I hoped she had some qualities, and I just acted as if she did until she proved otherwise. And I did the same with this process. These characteristics that I needed God to have if I was going to turn my will and my life over to Him. I hope she was honest, and I acted as if she was, and that she'd be faithful and loving and caring and had my back. And I walked through this process with her, and the difference is, that for me, anyways, we have this idea of, I had this idea that God made us in His image and likeness, and unfortunately, I returned the favor. I made God in our image and likeness with human qualities of vengefulness or pettiness or deservedness, and that's not been my experience. And going through with the rest of these steps and removing what's blocking me, I've found a God that's just all love all the time. I've never gone and surrendered something or gotten to a part where I was seeking God in my life and that power not show up. As Scott pointed out, 6 or 7 times in this chapter, we agnostics, that's the issue, right? Lack of power is my dilemma, and that's what the whole purpose of this book is about, is to put me in a position where I can access this power.
Thanks, John. Thanks for coming back. I'm always surprised. It's good to see you. I've discovered through the years that God's difficult to train. I don't know if you ever tried to train God by giving Him some instructions. Big fella, take a knee. I got some instructions for you. And what about that lottery ticket? And I tie it into a story. I had the privilege of driving airplanes for the United States Air Force, and I flew a 4-engine jet for a while. And we came out of Christchurch, New Zealand, and took on fuel at American Samoa, heading for Honolulu. It's about an 8-hour flight plan. And about halfway from Samoa to Honolulu, we get into the new fuel. It was contaminated. It had water in it. At our altitude, it's minus 50 degrees. They don't call it water, they call it ice. And it clogs the fuel lines. And jet engines about so big around do not respond well to that. And we come down into warmer air. We can run the engines down here, but we can't make Honolulu at this altitude. And it's already closer to go on than it is to go back. And there's nothing in between but water. Like ocean, kind of, the big pond. And a jet engine is more efficient the higher you take it. You get in trouble in fuel on a jet, you add power and climb, you'll get it back because of that higher altitude. So we add the power, we climb back up to an altitude where we can make it, we can't stay. Worst thing you can do for gas miles on an airplane is this, and that's what we're doing. Because the numbers say that we're going to put a 300,000-pound airplane into the Pacific Ocean about 160 or 70 miles an hour today, and we're all going to die. My guess would be a pretty good percentage of the folks in this room have had the experience for a moment or two of thinking we were going to die. We've laid down bikes and looked down gun barrels and drug deals gone bad and wrecked cars and trucks and faced jealous husbands. Oh, yeah. We've had the experience, many of us, for a moment or two. I would tell you that 4 hours is a long time to think you're going to die today. It's a rather different experience. And I promised to God I don't think I believed in, if He would get me out of this one, that I would quit smoking. That was first. Going to quit smoking, quit drinking, quit visiting ladies I'm not married to. I'm going back to church. I might build some churches. Trust me, you don't leave anything in the bag on this one. And 10 fuel tanks are all saying 0, and the engines are still turning. What we decided to do was to shoot a forced landing at Honolulu International. And we could make what's called high station for forced landing. We could at least crash on dry land so our bodies could be sent home for burial. That is the conversation in that cockpit. We turned final at Hickam at 9,000 feet. If they'd quit then, we'd have made the end of the runway. Touchdown. taxied in, shut them down, and they dipped our fuel tanks like you dip your crankcase, see how much oil you got? We did not have enough fuel left on that plane to start 4 engines and taxi to the door. We didn't have that much left. And I didn't even check into the hotel. I went straight to the bar, put my bags down on either side of the bar stool, Mai Tai, the big one, pack of Marlboros. Right? Right? You're still with me, right? Yeah. And this is what I see at the eyes that you've given me. In those days when I prayed, I was trying to make him my God. What I've been taught here is how to make me his man. See, I had it backwards. I had it backwards. The major difference is this one seems to work, that one never did, which is a minor problem. One of the other problems I got here with is I was terrified of God's will. Why'd Grandma die? Well, it's God's will. Well, it killed her. Plus, if you're even thinking it, you're going to hell, and I have not just been thinking it. I've been doing a pretty good bit of it. And so I had to take the concept, God's will, and break it into 2 pieces. Here's the first one. What am I going to be when I grow up? Where am I going to live? How much money am I going to make? What's going to happen to my children? Do the communists eventually take over the world? The pygmies in Africa never heard of Jesus. Can they go to heaven? And so on. All of that violates one day at a time, right? Because it's all off in the future, I consider the entire category to be God's plan. Second half of the first step says, I'm not in management, don't need to know what the plan is. Leaves me with God's will, which is very simply what we'd have me do today. I'm an alcoholic. I sponsor some guys. What a privilege. I've got a sponsor who knows what he's doing. I read the big book. I go to some meetings. I take meetings in the gated communities and treatment facilities. I'm a citizen. I vote. I'm going to tell you how I vote, too. I vote by secret ballot. I hope you do, too. We got to leave that outside. I got some kids. I'm trying to be a good dad. I got some grandkids. I'm trying to be a good grandfather. I've got a fabulous woman in my life. I'm faithful to her. I know what God's will is for me. I know what it is. It's to walk humbly in his presence today. There's one who has all power, that one is God may find him now. Now isn't when I find God, it's where. It's to walk humbly in his presence today, treating you guys like brothers and sisters, and doing my very best to be of service, spread love and joy. I know what God's will is. That got real simple for me. The people I see that seem to be wrapped around the axle about God's will are trying to figure out God's plan. And not being in management, it's not in my pay grade. It's way above my pay grade. So that helped me a lot, that God's will thing. And this is a gift from Miss Linda, that what I had to do is I had to come up, and John talked about it a lot. I had to have a God whose will was a good deal. I've become convinced, and I do forget this, that I think God's will is the best deal there is. I forget that. That's why I need to keep coming around. My spiritual bucket leaks. It has to be refilled all the time. I have a tendency to forget these things. John touched on something I'd like to get a little bit deeper into on page 12. So Ebby is sober 60 days in the Oxford groups, and he's come to New York City to his drunken friend Bill Wilson to try to carry a spiritual message. Bill is drunk on gin, pontificating about the czar of the heavens, which, as you may recall, gin is perfect for that. And I don't know this was the emotion, but this is how I visualize the scene. That Ebby kind of threw up his hands and said, why don't you choose your own conception of God? Now, I don't know that's how it happened, but that's how I hear it. And Bill thought it was so important, he put it in italics. When Bill wants to shout at me in this big book, he puts it in italics. When he wants to shout at me really loud, he puts it twice, and it's on page 93. John talked about this also. But I'm going to go a little bit deeper. About 6 lines down, he does not have to agree with your conception of God. He can choose any conception he likes, provided it makes sense to him, which I think, as John said, takes the doorknob and the light bulb pretty much out of the equation. And so when I get a new guy to sponsor, what I say to him is, I'm going to ask you not to disbelieve, but to disregard for a while what you believe about God, what you're trying to believe about God. You may not be able to tell those apart. And what they told you about God, and I don't care how qualified they claim to be. We're going to do what's working for 3 million of your closest friends. And we're going to come up with a God concept that works for you. And the way we're going to do it is I'm going to ask you for a series of single words and short phrases that describe the individual characteristics you would like for God to have. Not what they said, not what you think. Characteristics you would like for God to have. I'm going to participate. If you like my suggestions, take them. If you don't like them, don't take them. Don't let me sell you anything here. And I have him write it on the inside back cover of their big book because I'm going to ask him to read this morning and night for the next 30 days. And usually the first one I get is forgiving. And I tell him that's not good enough for me. I'm too guilty. I had to have a God that was eager to forgive. So if you like that, write it down. How about gentle? Doesn't force me to his will. Loving. Got to have loving. How about sense of humor? I want a God that laughs and dances. How about creative? A God that comes out with clever ways to get you out of the holes you keep digging in your own life. Need one that's creative. How about available to me all the time without exception? How about a God who wants what's best for me and knows what it is? Because clearly I don't. Because if I do, how did I get here? Right? I'm sorry, there's no answer to that. A God who wants what's best for me. And if and only if I can have all of those, I want a God that's powerful. But the God I was raised with, you wouldn't want to meet in a dark alley. Can't do it. John described it so beautifully. Can't do it with that God. But I want this one to have a tremendous amount of power. And I say to him, I'm not going to ask you to believe this. I don't think you can. All my life, religious people say, believe this. Really? Well, how? Well, just believe it. Well, they can't tell me and I can't tell you. I'm not going to ask you to believe it. I'm going to ask you to test drive it. How do you think you would conduct your life if you believe this? Conduct your life that way for a while. We'll just see what happens. Simple experiment. The scientists call it a working hypothesis. Excuse me. The term means we have reason to believe something may be true. We're now going to apply it in all cases and just see what happens. Again, remember, this is me talking to my sponsee. And I say to him, the reason we have to believe that that might be true, that's my God concept. And you must think mine's working or you would not have asked me to sponsor you. So I'm not going to ask you to believe it. You can't. But you test drive it. How would you conduct your life? And let's talk in detail about what that might mean. And I'm not going to ask you to have faith. I don't think you can. But I'm going to ask you to have hope. Why don't you hope this is true? Because faith is just hope with a track record. So let's start with hope. You can do that. Quit worrying about faith. It'll get here on time. It won't be early, but it'll get here on time. Our buddy Joe Krogan, I mentioned earlier, he said his sponsor said, Joe, we're going to have to make it very simple for you. Step one, you're screwed. Joe says, wow, it's going to take a miracle. He said, that's step two. Step three is, why don't you try for one? And Joe said, well, I don't believe in God. And his sponsor said, you don't have to believe in God to be successful here, but you must conduct your life like someone who does, which I think is the best definition of spirituality I have ever heard. Conduct your life like someone who does. Here's the problem I'm dealing with when I come to you. By the time I'm 7 or 8 years old, I become convinced of what was going to be. It was a lie, but it was the greatest truth in my life till I've been with you a couple of years. And that's that I'm not good enough. I'm one of the defective ones. There are things wrong with me that can't be fixed. And I became an actor as a small boy. And my act is I'm going to pretend to be the guy that I think you want me to be. And you is defined as whoever's in front of me right this second. In those days, I had a customer in Morristown, Tennessee, that was a very religious guy. He knew me as a very religious Scot. I had a customer in Knoxville, it's a Friday night party kind of guy. He knows a Friday night party kind of Scot. Got the boys in the pool room where I buy my dope and drink my beer. They know that Scot. Neighbors, business partners, family members, everyone knows a different Scot. And the greatest fear in my life, people from different parts of my life be at the same place, same time. How am I going to act? How am I doing? Pretty close, right? So if I'm awake, I'm on yellow, somewhere between yellow and red alert, trying to hold up the right mask to keep you from seeing the real me. Because if you can see the real me, like I see the real me, you'll realize I'm garbage and you will clearly throw me away. A bunch of together people like you would clearly not have a defective model around if you knew. And so I've got to be something, and being Scott ain't going to work. So I'm going to take on this persona. I'm going to be the second coming of John Wayne, except for the fighting. I'm too pretty to fight. But I'm going to take on the John Wayne, I call it the John Wayne syndrome. And here's the set of characteristics that I take on. Big boys don't cry. Pull yourself up by your bootstraps. When the going gets tough, the tough gets going. Never let them see your weakness. Never ask a stupid question. Get what you want. It'll make you happy. Never surrender. Never give up, no matter what. Never apologize. It's a sign of weakness. How am I doing? Yeah, pretty close. Yeah. Turns out all of that is precisely wrong, by the way, without exception. That's all exactly perfectly wrong. But that's the act I'm doing when I get to you. Still convinced in the core of my being This ancient truth that's actually a lie, that I'm not good enough, makes all of my choices. All of them. And learning to lay down that old act, I still fall into it. I do. I still fall into it. Not as often as I used to. I don't stay as long, but I still find myself back into it. Trying to be something to impress you. Trying to be something to make you like me. When the fact is, this loving, laughing God that created, get ready, created smallmouth bass, watermelon, and sex, nice job, was not having a bad day in the middle of a long losing streak when he created me or any of you. It didn't happen that way. And yet my belief on that ran my life. So I had to begin with the God who was not having a bad day in the middle of a long losing streak when he created me, so that I could begin to shed those old skins, those old masks. So our mission here, if you're new, I don't think is to try to change you into anything. You're already everything you've ever needed to be. But you got all this garbage on top of you. Don Pritz, do not think about going to bed tonight without getting one of Don's talks. Get his talk when he took AA to Russia, among other things. But he said, the alcoholic is like an electromagnet that's been dragged through the junkyard of life. We get all this rusty, jagged, nasty, sharp stuff stuck all over us. And it's mostly defenses we don't need and probably never did. And what we do through this step process is we get a hold of that power control for that electromagnet. We begin to turn that power down, and those things fall away. John talked about subtraction. These things fall away, and this beautiful thing you've always been emerges. We're not here to change you into anything. There is a flicker of the great eternal fire within all of us. And our job here is to get the garbage up off of it and fan it into a blaze. And that's what this whole thing is about, is to help us evolve into who we've always really been instead of that act. My fear was that who I really was not worthy of success, was not worthy of respect, was not worthy of love. I mean, fill in the blanks off the plus column. I didn't think was worthy of any of that. And I was just wrong. I said I got here believing so many of the things that were wrong. That's just a few of them. And I was just wrong. And as I live into this, what happens is, I like me. I'm a pretty good guy. You'd be fortunate if you get to spend time with me. That's not ego. That's who God created. I have got a number one problem in my life today. Biggest problem I have, I deal with it every day of my life. I have more spectacular people in my life than I have time for. And I've been living that for years, decades now. What a phenomenal experience. And that's who we all are. That's who we all are. So this is about going through this process, about digging. I think the first 9 steps are about digging this poison out of my soul so that the real me can just kind of blossom. That's what it's about. And although some of those steps probably look to you like they were designed to punish you, we thought so too, and that's not what happened. The only things that have ever treated my alcoholism are drinking alcohol or taking an alcohol substitute. That's one. Or having a spiritual awakening as the result of these steps. But a spiritual awakening, there was a moment this morning when I was asleep. The very next moment I was awake. When I finished my first set of prayers, I was more awake. When I finished brushing my teeth, I was more awake. When I stepped out of the shower, I was more awake. When I finished my first cup of coffee, I was more awake. A spiritual awakening is of that nature. I used to say there is no last lesson, but I've discovered that there is. Maybe we'll talk about that later. But it's possible to go back to sleep. I've only seen 2 people that I'm absolutely certain did these 12 steps drink again. I sponsored them both. One of them married his new higher power. And we say, I wonder how she likes him now. That news was in the newspaper in the legal notices not too long after that when she divorced his ignorant butt. And he's back now and had the privilege of giving him his 11-year chip a couple of weeks ago. And the other one and I know he did the steps because I took him through them. And she didn't like how much time we spent with us. And we got him back. And the other one is a hotel manager. And he got a job running a dude ranch in Arizona 40 miles away from the nearest meeting and quit going. And 2 years later, he drank for 2 weeks. Today, he's sober about 15 years. The only 2 people I know for certain did these steps and drank again, and they went back to sleep spiritually. So that's why I say my spiritual bucket leaks. I have to continue to refill it. But if I stay awakened spiritually, I just don't get thirsty. And it just doesn't matter what happens. I just simply don't get thirsty. I didn't know I was going to tell this. This is a horror story. It has a happy ending. Please embrace that. Sometime the night of the 4th of July of 1990, my daughter fired a pistol into her mouth. I found her in her bed in a pool of blood the next morning. And let me tell you, and I do not hold myself up as a shining example. I am not one. I hold this up and the God of my understanding. This is what you had done with me. The first thing I did was kneel at her bed. And I said, God, if it's your will to take her, take her. If it's your will for her to stay here a mess, okay. If it's your will for her to recover, okay. What you had done with me was put me in a position to hold the most precious thing in my life up to a God who is worthy of that and say, your will, not mine, be done. I still can't believe it, but that's what I did. We dialed 911. We raced to Vanderbilt Hospital. For the first 4 days, they said, this is a successful suicide. She's just not gone yet. We cannot save her. She's got a breathing tube. She's a nightmare to look at. She's conscious now. She was not conscious when I found her. She's conscious now. And she can squeeze your hand once for yes and twice for no, and she don't want to die anymore. And 4 days is a long time. And I believe if I had not had a spiritual awakening as the result of these steps, the man who came to you in the summer of 1984 might well have been capable of first-degree murder. And that didn't have to happen. Let me tell you what you did. By dark that day, the waiting room at Vanderbilt Hospital had 3 times this many AA and Al-Anon members in it. 3, 4 times. There was over 200 of you in there doing a prayer vigil. Sometime over the next few days, at one point I went home and packed a bag, and I moved into Vanderbilt Hospital, moved into her hospital room, and I didn't leave the campus of that hospital for 60 days. You can pretend to care. You cannot pretend to show up. You showed up. Was not a time the next 60 days wasn't a member of my home group, closest I had been right here. 60 days, 24 hours a day. One or more of you were there. Not to stop me from drinking, they never talked about it. So that one of my people would be there to hold me. If I need to cry at 3 o'clock in the morning, one of my people would be there to hold me. Don't tell me I'm a word merchant myself. Show me. You showed me. These are the kind of people who show up. I had been taught to cry by a member of my home group. He was a very famous guy. And I used to say to him, I went to him one day, I was sober 2 years, and I said, tell me about the tears. And he says, man, somebody says something beautiful, and I just weep, and it feels so good. And I said, I can't cry. He taught me. He said he would, and he did. It took me a while. And I learned to cry. My emotions are how my spirit communicates to my mind and my body. And I can't afford to block that channel. If you disrespect a man that cries, I'm sad for you. I really am. If you can't cry, if you will see me, I typed it up. I've got a handout. I can teach you to cry. I should warn you, gentlemen, if you start crying at appropriate times and places, you'll attract a lot of women. Do not call me and complain about this, for I warned you right up front, okay? Because they're sick of that John Wayne act you've been doing. They see right through it, don't you, ladies? Oh, yeah. Y'all are so much deeper than we are. My daughter lived. She's blind in one eye. She lost a little coordination. They cured her headaches a couple of years ago. She would not take pain medication once she left the hospital because of our family history of drug abuse and alcoholism. As a friend of mine says, you shake my family tree, bottles fall out. That's just the way it is. And by mistake, somebody noticed something, and they cured her headache. She only gets one on rare occasion. She lived with a headache for about a decade and wouldn't take anything for it. And she and her husband presented us with a granddaughter 13 years ago, and she's doing just fine. And I sponsored 2 guys whose only son was killed. Both the boys were teenagers. They were both only sons. And I watched those 2 guys go through that. And I watched them on the floor in the fetal position screaming. These were separate incidents. And pain beyond anything I can begin to imagine. And I watched them go through this, and not only did they not drink, they never got thirsty. Both sober over 30 years right now. I watched it. So I know why we drink. Because we either didn't have a spiritual awakening or because we went back to sleep spiritually, because it is possible to do that. I would tell you a story. Hippie James and that's, you're lucky in A if you get a nickname you like. And Hippie James liked his name. He's a hippie born 3 generations too late. He was 17 when I started sponsoring him, and he's a hippie for sure. And but he told me one day, he said, this outfit called Fish, they spell it funny, but they make music, and they're going to have their last concert. I said, James, it's their last concert, trust me. But he says, I'm going to go. I said, well, great. He couldn't get anybody to go. So I think it was in Vermont, but it was like a 30-hour drive. He comes back and he tells this in my home group. And it's the 30-hour drive. He drives straight through to get there to find out that the car line to get into park is another 5 hours. And he's going to sleep at the wheel, which is not a problem to park car. The problem is people are passing him. So he gets out of the Hippie Mobile, which he said is, the Hippie Mobile is 20 years old, which is 80 in car years, as I think you know. And he pops the trunk, he pulls out the Coleman stove, he puts it on the lid, and he's making coffee and soup. He's having coffee and soup, and he's sharing it with people in other cars, because he said, I realized if I were going to stay awake physically, I was going to have to stay active physically. And then he said, if I'm going to stay awake spiritually, I'm going to have to stay active spiritually. And isn't that what step 2 is about? It's about the commitment to try to become active spiritually. Came to believe. Those things work pretty well. And my beloved pointed this out, the evolution of the God concept through the steps and traditions. We begin with a power greater than ourselves. We go to God as you understand Him. And then when we get into the traditions, we find loving God. Do you see the evolution? So that's how it is with us. And for those who are new and you haven't done the steps and you've looked at step 9 and you know that there are some amends you cannot make, let me tell you what Jerry Crow told me. He said those steps have been put numbers in front of them so smart college boys like you don't take them out of order. So it ain't time. And amends requires adult supervision. You're going to make a mess instead of an amend. Trust me, that's experience you're hearing. I made a mess. So it's not time to do that. But if you've got some amends you're sure you can't make, don't worry about it. That's not a good reason not to do step 4. Because through this process, my experience has been, as you do each of these steps, your God will get a little bigger. Your concept of God didn't get bigger, but your concept will get bigger. And although as you sit here on whatever step you're on, your God may not be big enough to do step 9, by the time you get to step 9, you might be surprised that He's gotten bigger. I think maybe that's one of the definitions of spirituality that I like, is the willingness for my concept of God to get bigger and to be open so that that can happen. John?
Thanks, Scott. I don't know how to follow that. In the few minutes that we have left, I want to point out a couple things in the book that I failed to. And, you know, I don't know, I sponsor a bunch of really literal guys. They want to know, you know, where in the book does it say this and where does it say that? And there's really just one short question for the second step of, you know, we talked about the first step question on page 44 at the beginning of this chapter, right? It says, you know, in the previous chapters we described you of alcoholism, and that question we talked about. But on 47 it says we just need to ask ourselves one short question. Do I now believe, or am I even willing to believe there's a power greater than myself? As soon as a man can say that he does believe or is willing to believe, we emphatically assure him that he is on his way. It has been repeatedly proven among us that upon this simple cornerstone, a wonderfully effective spiritual structure can be built. And that's all I need to move forward. I don't have to believe any of these things. I don't have to... for me, the main point is that something else can fix me. Because if I think I can fix me, I'm not ready. And my favorite page in this chapter in We Agnostics, I think really tells us where to find God, because I've looked for God everywhere. The casinos, the bedroom, in the sports car, and, you know, I believe God is everywhere, of course. You know, one of the biggest curses that, or blessings, however you want to put it, that I was told in Alcoholics Anonymous was that everything out of your mouth is a prayer. As soon as you believe that, you're in trouble. But it tells us where to find God. On 55, the second full paragraph, actually we're fooling ourselves, for deep down in every man, woman, and child is the fundamental idea of God. It may be obscured, which means blocked, by calamity, pomp, worship of other things, but in some form of others it is there. For faith and a power greater than ourselves, and miraculous demonstrations of that power in human lives are as fact as man himself. Skipping forward a sentence or two, it says, he was as much a fact as we were. We found the great reality, and that's capitalized because we're talking about a God there, who's deep down within us. In the last analysis, it is only there that he may be found. It was so with us. And there's another, all throughout this book, it says that this is just about removing what's blocking us. It's as simple as that, and growing that ember that Scott talked about and fanning the flames.
I got a couple of more things.
Yeah.
On page 46, and John touched on it, but I want to lean on it just a little bit. On page 46, the last paragraph begins with the word much. If you count up 3 lines and begin in the middle of the page, even though it was impossible for any of us to fully define or comprehend that power which is God. So when we talk at God as you understand Him in steps 3 and 11, we're not saying you're going to understand God. Ms. Linda says if God were small enough to understand, He wouldn't be big enough to handle the things I'm going to need for Him to handle. It means I don't have to believe what anybody else ever told me about God, and I don't care how qualified they claim to be. Don Pritz used to say, God will reveal Himself to me as I reveal myself to me. Isn't that a little bit about what some of this step work is about? And then, John, for about 5 lines from the bottom, we found that God does not make too hard terms of those who seek Him. In Tennessee English, it says, God's not mad at me. Gee, that was good news. That was good news. Because He's keeping score. I am way behind. There is no way to catch up. On page 25, Bill references the fourth dimension. The paragraph begins with the great fact. Count up about 3 lines. We have found much of heaven and have been rocketed into a fourth dimension of existence of which we had not even dreamed. Bill uses the metaphor of the fourth dimension also on page 8. Paragraph begins with the word trembling most of the way down. It says, I was soon to be catapulted into what I like to call the fourth dimension of existence. Einstein said the 4 dimensions are width, depth, height, and time. The time I'm rocketed into is right now, a place that the alcoholic rarely visits. I am, and this is one of those, I heard myself say this the other day in a meeting, and I didn't know it until I was saying it. The first 9 steps give me my innocence back. 10 and 11 keep me innocent. If I'm innocent, I can be right here, right now. If I'm guilty, I'm in the past wondering who saw it, who knows. I'm in the future, what kind of lie am I going to tell? What's going to have to happen? What if, plan B, plan C, plan J. So it is the innocence I'm given through the first 9 steps and kept in 10, 11 that allow me to be right here, right now, and that narrow membrane between the past and the future known as the present. If I don't stay innocent, I can't stay here. Don used to say, don't do anything that dims your light. So I have to stay here. So Bill talked about rocketing and catapulting into the fourth dimension, but he described what for him was the fourth dimension. I'm continuing on page 8. I was to know happiness, peace, and usefulness in a way of life that is incredibly more wonderful as time passes. Happiness, I understand that. Peace, I'm comfortable in my own skin. Isn't it fascinating that he used the word usefulness? So if we look on page 52, I think it is, the bedevilments, just below the middle of the page, we were unhappy. We couldn't seem to be of real help to other people. If you will look in the 9th step promises, and I just noticed this the other day, and I've read this book a couple of times. This is some of that new stuff that John talked about. On page 84, I'll find it here in a minute. Oh, yeah, 3rd line. That feeling of uselessness and self-pity will disappear. I note that Bill paired uselessness and self-pity. That if I become useful, my self-pity disappears. That he talks about this being useful thing over here on page 8. Happiness, peace, and usefulness. Because without the usefulness, I can't keep those others. At least that's been my experience. You got something? We done?
We're done. Save it for next one.
11 minutes and 6 seconds. I'll see you back here.